Right off the bat, I when I looked in his eyes, I knew he was a cold-blooded killer. I'd never looked into the eyes of someone who didn't have a soul. I mean, he was a trained assassin.
This is Mind for Survival with your host, Brian Duff.
You have an amazing, I don't know, like I said earlier, it's this tragic story, but it's this amazing story. And I feel you're at the place where you are because you went through all that struggle and that strife. So let people know about your background and everything, if you would.
Okay, great. So I am a psychiatrist. I'm in private practice. I've been in private practice almost 35 years. I used to run the psychiatric emergency room at St. Vincent's. I was in academic medicine about 10 years. And currently, I am a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, at the ICAM School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And I teach psychiatric residents and have a private practice. And I used to be an elite endurance athlete. I ran ultra marathons and Ironman and even won some of them and placed overall in some of them. I was a serious athlete before I got poisoned, and most of that winning races certainly has been taken away from me. I can place in my age group, but I'm not winning races anymore. Sadly, I'm laughing because it's ironic, but it was a big blow. But in the long run, the paradox was that being poisoned by a KGB agent, I was given so much because I had a spiritual awakening that just expanded me. I really went from the transactional world, which is the phenomenal world of things that you can see, and in more the materialistic world, to the noumenal world or the spiritual world, which is more about interconnectedness and things that you can't see. Like psychiatry, for instance, deals more with the noumenal world because we're dealing with emotions and the unconscious. So there are things that you can't really see. They're not necessarily tangible. And so that was actually a huge gift, although I did lose my health, a lot of my health. Yeah.
Now, can you go into your backstory on let people know how you were poisoned and what led up to that?
Definitely. So in 2005, I went to Chechnya, which I went into the Second Chechen War voluntarily to provide medical, psychiatric, and psychological care to Chechens who were being killed by the Russian army. And I went with a man who ran an international disabled running club. I had volunteered a lot with his running club. I had led athletes in the New York City Marathon in wheelchairs. I had run with blind runners. I led a blind climber to the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. So I had been very involved, and we also did start a chapter for the disabled Chechen children in Chechnya. But basically, I went there to help and to start this running club for the children who all don't have limbs and have penises blown off and horrible injuries. So I went there with this man, and the only way we got in, because Chechnya was a stranglehold of Russia. It's surrounded by Russian military tanks. When I was there, I've never seen so many Russian military tanks in one place. It was very frightening. And the only way we got in was that this man, who was presented to me, I should say, as a sports writer's journalist, which he is, but that is his cover, for the fact that he's a KGB agent, was with us the whole time and shadowed us, made sure that he knew exactly what we were doing. He actually stole $3,000 from me, which I was going to give to the Chechens, and he stole clothes that the man that I was with, who was going to give them to the Chechens, he also stole all that clothes. So he particularly didn't like me because I was a do-gooder. I was there and I did provide medical, psychiatric, psychological care to the children. So he particularly didn't like me for that reason. The man that I was with was more concerned really with starting the running club and getting his name, unfortunately, in the newspapers, which we were. We were in the Russian, the Chechen newspaper, and we also eventually were in the New York Post because I worked really stridently and ferociously to get three of the boys out to get more extensive medical care in New York City. So we were able to pay for their plane fare and their medical care. I got doctors just to, out of the kindness of their heart, provide medical care to these boys. And we provided them with new prosthetics and medical care. And then they went home. But so when I was there, I developed flu-like symptoms. And then 3 days later, I couldn't get out of bed. I had high fever. I had projectile vomiting of blood and diarrhea with blood. And when I tried to get out of bed, I fell. And, at the time I was an elite athlete. So I knew right away, as if I was my own emergency room patient, that I had been poisoned. And it probably had been put in my food or in my drink. And for 3 years, I lived in a liminal space between life and death, really closer to death than to life. I barely could manage to get myself to work. I am a really tough individual and I persevere pretty much through anything. And I would walk a block to work and I would have to rest for an hour at work before seeing patients. It took a phenomenal amount of energy just for me to lift my head up in the morning. And then after I should say, during that 3 years, I had pneumonia. I had GI parasitic infections chronically for about 17 years. I developed 20 food allergies, never had any allergies in my life. I was always the picture of robust health. And those food allergies did change over the years. So I developed other food allergies. Basically, anything I ate, and I have a very healthy diet, I would develop an allergy to because my body was in hypervigilant mode. It was trying to protect me, as it had from this poison, but it's sort of like you can't turn it off. So I currently have an autoimmune disorder. So I get tired a lot, for instance. But I persevere. I'm tough, and it's been a long journey. It took me 5 years to have the energy to begin to investigate my symptoms and what I was poisoned with. And I did investigating on the internet. I found out that our military had vaccinated U.S. military who went to Russia because it was common knowledge that they poisoned people with anthrax, man-made anthrax. So many of the symptoms of the people that had been poisoned were similar to mine. Many of the men died from heart attacks. Luckily, I did not have that. But many of the women had symptoms such as I had, I had horrible rashes around my mouth, around my eyes. My eyes would blow up. Well, they still do blow up, but not as much as they used to. They used to blow up in the morning. I couldn't even open them. I had autoimmune disorders like many of the women, and many of the women also developed pneumonia as well. And I had to really search for homeopathic ways to treat it. I was lucky enough to talk to one of the post office workers that had been exposed with inhalational anthrax. And I learned that thieves, which is an essential oil, kills anthrax. So I did, for instance, this is just one for instance, I did a high dose detox with thieves, actually many times. And it was a long journey. I was tested on the Rife machine. The Rife machine is also not legal in this country. It's legal in Germany, and it basically treats people through vibrational frequencies. So if you have a certain bacteria or virus, it has a certain vibrational frequency. And on biological testing of my hair, my fingernails and morning sputum, she found that I had man-made anthrax all throughout my body. So that also was very much a directive for me then to investigate. And it really has been a long, long journey of trying to uncover people. For instance, I found a doctor at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland, who was trying to create a blood test for people that had been poisoned with anthrax. But she said that after 3 years, most people don't have antibodies anymore, so you can't detect anthrax in the blood. And when I had found her, which was in 2012, so I was poisoned in 2005. And when I had my blood tested with this woman at the NIH, it was 2012, and she said, it's too far out. But many Western doctors are challenged. They don't see people who are poisoned. They don't know about anthrax. Even specialists led me astray saying, oh, we'll test your blood. And there is no blood test for anthrax other than when you're actively sick with it, when you're septic, which is like a blood infection. If you think of it, which most people aren't going to think of it because it presents as blood poisoning, which is why the FSB use it. It's a perfect cover to kill people. If you think of anthrax poisoning, you have to draw the blood during the acute phase of it in order for it to grow out in a culture. And there have been some incidents of that at Harvard. There was a case of a woman who was drumming and the spores came off of the drum and she inhaled it. So I should say anthrax is a bacteria that's endemic in the soil in the Middle East. So also doctors there are more familiar with it. Also poisoning is more familiar in the Middle East. So they know how to recognize it and treat it more. In this country, anthrax has a really high incidence of mortality. I think 68% for GI anthrax. And yeah, so it was a sheepskin that this woman was drumming on, and the spores, she inhaled them. So that's a long story to answer your question.
No, that's so interesting. It's what goes through your mind when you realize I'm sure, when we all start getting sick, it's like, I'm sick. I have this virus, this bacteria or something. But then when you realize that, oh, I'm not only sick, I'm actually poisoned with man-made anthrax by the KGB. What goes through your mind when something like that?
Oh, initially, well, I should say right off the bat with this man, when I got off the plane in Russia, he met us. And I had to use the ladies' room, and he told me that I couldn't use the ladies' room, that there wasn't time. So we got into this car, and this is all in the book, by the way. I was in the back with him, and I knew something was off with him. And I whispered in the ear to the man I was with, could you please say you have to use the bathroom? And sure enough, we were driven to a place where we could go to the bathroom. But right off the bat, when I looked in his eyes, I knew he was a cold-blooded killer. I'd never looked into the eyes of someone who didn't have a soul. I mean, he was a trained assassin. And so I figured it out really quickly, although I wasn't told. The man I was with knew he was a KGB agent. And they had actually done work together. I won't even get into that. I don't mean espionage or something, but they had worked a lot together with this man starting running clubs all throughout Russia. And they had a 25-year-long history together.
Oh, wow.
So, but when I was treated that way, I'm a physician. I was an elite athlete. Mm-hmm. Even though I was raised not to have a voice and be a good Catholic girl and not to be seen and not to be heard, I've learned in life that I need to assert myself if I want to get anywhere. And that was just a simple affront to him that how dare I have any needs. At one point, I was using the bathroom. So we were in a general's house in Ingushetia, which is a neighboring province next to Chechnya. And I was using the bathroom. He walked in on me in the bathroom and told me to get out. And I told him, I'm not getting out. Like, this is inappropriate behavior, get out. So he, needless to say, didn't like me, but I was enraged. I was furious. I felt betrayed by the man who brought me there, who didn't tell me this. And when I confronted him, he very quickly didn't want to talk about it, because I said I was going to go to the New York Times with this, American citizen is poisoned in Chechnya, providing medical psychiatric care. It's pretty outrageous. No, it took a long time for me to process my anger, and but to be bitter and angry doesn't help me. And
No.
what I learned from it, which was to slow down and to embrace my vulnerabilities, to admit that I have that I'm frail, that I'm not this superwoman who can, charge into any war zone and just come out unscathed, that I actually am more than I thought I was in many ways, that I'm this loved person, that the universe always loved and recognized me, and I was always held by the universe. And so it was a gift. Paradoxically, being poisoned, it was a gift, not only for me but also my patients. It changed the way I worked with my patients. I felt I couldn't do my job just in the very Western way psychiatry is practiced, even though I was a psychoanalyst as well. And I have very loving, intense relationships with my patients, but I began to work with them much more spiritually. And they also began to, well, some of them, not all of them, to have the ability to make impasses through struggles that they couldn't get through and understand. So that's the paradox of all this, and that's what my book is about.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and I think it's so hard to get there. I know I've, and all my listeners, they know my struggles with PTSD. It was probably 4 or 5 years, and a lot. And where I really made progress was just kind of checking out of society and spending 3 years mostly in the woods of Michigan, figuring myself out, and why am I agitated? Why do I feel this way? And it's probably that was started in late 2017 when I was diagnosed. I mean, obviously it was there before that. You mentioned that, about going to a war zone and how I shouldn't have this expectation. And I did the same. I spent 10 years or over 10 years in these war zones. And then when I was finally diagnosed, it kind of hit me like, how ludicrous was it for me to think that I would go to these war zones, have all these experiences, and just everything would be fine. Like there's nothing there. And it kind of like where you're saying that you now, you relate to your patients in a different way. You have this different view on how you look at the world in a lot of ways. The same thing, I can relate to that because I think we talked about it when we spoke the other day is, well, I wouldn't wish post-traumatic stress on anyone. It's the worst. And I've dealt as a paramedic, I've dealt with a lot of really terrible things. It's the worst thing that I've ever dealt with, as far as you don't feel you have control, like you're just grasping at straws. And coming out of it, mostly in the last year, coming out the other end of it, I don't know that I could have gotten to this point of how I relate to the world and everything had I not gone through it. And it's this, I'm still struggling on that one in a way. It's in a way, and what I've told some people, I talk with people who call me up and ask, hey, can you help me with my PTSD? I'm having a bad time right now. And I kind of relate it when they're ready. While it's the most terrible thing I've ever been through, in a way, it's almost the most beautiful thing because I've changed so much of who I am and how I interact and relate to the world and people. And, I'm so empathetic. You mentioned that, you spent 3 years closer to death than life, and that led to this amazing spiritual awakening and embracing of other people's humanity. What do you mean by that? Explain that. I love that.
Yeah. I think first I had to really embrace my own humanity, that I have vulnerabilities, that I am frail, that I am not this superwoman. So growing up, I was brought up to to super achieve at sports, to super achieve at school, to not have any needs, and also not to be given proper equipment to compete. But yet I still was supposed to like win. And I developed this counterphobic, invincible attitude. Luckily, God made me an athlete. Most of the people in my family are really athletic, which was a blessing because I feel like that saved me. If I didn't have that as a child, I don't really know how I would have felt good and adequate, even if it was momentarily when I was succeeding at the sports. But very much I was brought up the military motto: we're going to break you down, but instead of building you back up, which is what they think they do in the military, or I hope they do, my parents didn't build us back up. So as a consequence of that, I had this, what I call, it's in the book, this warrior queen attitude of I should be able to go help anyone in any situation, no matter how dangerous it is, and both of us should be fine. And that got me so far in life. And, there were consequences to going to dangerous places, both physically, emotionally, psychologically. So similar to you, I have nightmares of planes flying into buildings. I was also a first responder at 9/11, and I developed breast cancer. But I have intrusive thoughts of people jumping out of tall buildings on fire and such things. But what I found is what you said, that even though it was the worst thing I've ever been through, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, when I was sick and dying, I really was the most spiritually expanded, and I felt interconnected with spirit, God, the universe, however you want to look at it. When I say a spiritual awakening, I don't mean a religious awakening, but that I felt that I was held by the universe and seen and loved. And I never, ever had that feeling before. And I knew it. I knew it deep down in my soul. And it was a profound feeling of harmony and joy, which I don't think I had ever experienced before, ironically, even though I was really, really sick. I was closer to death than life. My patients will remind me about how sick I was and how sickly I looked and how much better I look now. Because when you're traumatized like that, you don't remember really. It's hard for you to hold on to it. And it's the irony of this, that the best thing that ever happened to me was being poisoned, because I changed and grew and expanded as a person. For instance, I forgave my family more, and I understood more the way they are, why they are. I mean, I always understood it. Both my parents grew up in really poor families. They had nothing. My dad was a depression baby. His father came here at the age of 16 from Italy to make money to bring the rest of his family. He welded iron for the George Washington Bridge and was such a hard worker, my grandfather. But, he didn't know how to love. He didn't have the luxury of learning how to love. I mean, he had to work really from an early age on to support his family. And he was really hard. Like he was impossible to please. And my father was very similar. Like he demanded a lot of us, and he wasn't ever going to tell us we did a good job. I have a funny story about that, which I can share with you, which is I played basketball in high school, and there was a girl who was the daughter of the head of the phys ed department. So she needed to get a scholarship to go to college. I would be beating her in points in the game, so I would be pulled out of the game so that she would have more points than me in the game. And my father would always say, she was a more polished basketball player than me. Like I had just played with boys and my brothers, but she had been primed by her father from an early age to be a great basketball player. I was just a really natural athlete. And it was like right before he died at 91, that he said to me, "Oh, and you were actually a better player than this woman." And I mean, I felt so bad for him because at that point, it didn't mean anything to me. Like I had already resolved those horrible feelings in high school, because I think I was playing basketball to try to get his love and recognition. But I just felt that I could really forgive my parents, and that I was more empathic in particular to my mother, who really projected a lot of her undigested trauma with her mother on me, because her mother had 12 kids. My mom was the oldest girl, so she had to often be a parent to her siblings, and also worked her way through college as well as my father did. And she was embarrassed at her mother's pregnancies, and I think she projected all of that on me. But I always understood it psychologically, so I can't even explain it. I just felt more love and compassion to them. When I woke up from surgery after my mastectomy, I had this experience of not being in the world. It really felt like I was in a spiritual realm. It was total light. And something told me, have more empathy for your mother. And ever since then, I really have. I have more love and empathy for her. So.
Yeah, I think that's so, and I don't know what it is with empathy and love and all that, in the sense that I had a somewhat of a similar upbringing, and I talk about in my book that's coming out, with my mother, who I love her because she did the best she could with what she had. And when I speak to people about PTSD, I say, the wild thing is, I mean, even if you go back to the beginning of the last century, you went into basically World War I, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, World War II. And I'm like, all these people were so traumatized and there was no help. And I sometimes say, it's wild when you think about World War II. A huge percentage of the population goes off to war. Those that aren't at war are supporting the war effort and worried about their loved ones who are overseas. So there's that trauma. Everybody comes home. There's this big rise in like fraternal organizations, the Masons, the Elks Lodge, the Moose Lodge. And I said, what do they all have in common? All the men get dressed up in their suits, which is like a uniform, and they go hang out with their buddies who were probably involved in the war somehow, and they all have drinks to help cope. And it's at that same time in the 50s when the women who were expected to get up and, like clean the house dressed up in your uniform, the women who are dealing with all these men that came home from war, that's when the, Valium and everything really took off, Mother's Little Helper. And then we move into the 60s, and the 60s kind of ignite. And I'm like, it's just been this repeat cycle of this trauma. And when it comes to the empathy side, somewhere during my process, empathy just became, I think it was when I was diving into my core values: character, love, hope, and independence. And that I really started looking for people's why, and as in a form of empathy, like, why are they doing what they do? Why do they believe it? Because a lot of it isn't, it's not that they necessarily have control. They're doing, while they bear responsibility for their actions, there's so much influence that has shaped how they're going to behave moving down the world. In my case, I'm 100% believe that the reason I became a lifeguard and then EMT, a paramedic at 21. Then that was and a firefighter in Southern California. Well, that's not good enough. Let me become an Army Ranger and let me constantly like this thing of I'm going to protect the world. But really what I was doing was in some weird way, trying to protect myself.
Well, I think because I've done the same thing, it's trying to undo the trauma of your childhood. I too was a lifeguard and constantly, I played professional tennis when I was 35. I wanted to play when I was 13, but my family didn't support me. I played first in college and high school, and then that wasn't enough. Then I had to become this elite endurance athlete. It was always like trying to prove my worthiness, trying to undo the trauma of my childhood. I was literally running from my rage and anger with my mother and trying to undo the trauma of your childhood. And it doesn't work. It just doesn't.
No. How does that when people and in my space, right, in the preparedness space, people are preparing because they're worried about the future. They're worried about problems. And so, which is a fear-based thing, right? And I know when I did 6 weeks for my post-traumatic stress in Utah and an inpatient, and I remember my therapist she was traumatized. She could never be good enough. So she was a double PhD. And I remember her telling me that, or telling the group that 65+% of first responders and military and people in those kind of professions all have traumatic childhoods. How does those, and I try to tell people, like, it's not necessarily that you had to have an abusive childhood. It's your perception of not being safe, your perception of that as a child, which doesn't always understand everything. How does that set us up for this, these not feeling safe down the road or trying to do these things to keep ourselves safe? How does that get us down that path?
Yeah, I think it's the gift of, there's a book on it, and I can't remember the woman's name, but it's the story of the gifted child, where the child is striving in sports or in achievement or academically to try to, you twist yourself into a pretzel to try to get your parents to change. They have their own trauma and their own scars, and they're just trying to survive. And you want to get them to recognize you and to love you, and it doesn't happen. And I think it's this gift. It's the story of the gifted child, where I think you're able to strive to try to achieve and to do, to super perform. I feel like I was a poster for super performing at everything. I had to excel at everything, and it was never good enough. It was always the next race I had to win, or how do I up the ante? I'll run like a triple Ironman in order to feel worthy, and it didn't work. And ironically, getting poisoned and being a chronic bedridden patient, except for being able to struggle to crawl literally to go to work, was what expanded me and what made me realize my own beauty and people's humanity, and that we all have problems and issues and struggles. It's just endemic to humankind.
The human condition.
Yeah, I just think it's a struggle a lot of children have that are able to achieve and perform, and that are gifted. And it's a double-edged sword.
How do the traumatic experiences that we have as an adult lead to the anxiety, the depression, panic attacks, and I'm going into all my personal experiences where, one day you're this, you're this powerful person who is, doing multiple triathlons, you're going to war zones and all of this. And, in my case, somewhat similar. And then then you end up, I can't leave the house because I didn't realize that I was terrified, but I can't leave the house because of this. I'm just in a nonstop panic attack or a nonstop depression. Difficulty even taking a shower.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that PTSD is so common in people that have, like you, been in war zones and seen horrible trauma. I think how can you not have PTSD? I mean, if
I
you
agree.
don't have that empathy, I really think something is off with that person. But what happens with trauma in particular is that trauma is processed differently in the central nervous system than regular memory. So regular memory is stored in the prefrontal cortex. So it has verbal memory to it so that we can relate it as a story. But when you have a significant trauma, it's stored in the amygdala, and it's fragmented in time. It can appear like the trauma is happening in the present, the past, and the future, or all of those things at the same time. It's fragmented. It is not verbal memory, it is visual memory. So that's why you get flashbacks in pieces and parcels of it, because it's not fully digested, because it's too overwhelming to the human psyche to process and terrifying. And it's nonverbal visual memory. So often what happens is that people that have a significant trauma will have flashbacks during the day and actually can feel like they're in that war zone, if it's in a war zone, that they're being shot at or that they're in danger, and it feels real. Like they'll hear a loud sound, and that loud sound will be fire or a bomb or whatever trauma that they had that they're reliving it again. And it feels really real. And it's a way for the psyche to try to get the person to put the pieces of the puzzle together, which is so hard to do. And, it's been my life journey helping people with significant sexual, physical trauma to remember it, not just as a daydream or a nightmare, but to actually remember what happened and not be that dissociated, that they're outside of their body, that they can begin to experience it in their body and remember more what happened. So it's more of a timeline and a story, and they begin to uncover more and more memories of it. And then that they can begin to associate feelings to it. Because what happens with a significant trauma, it's flight or flight.
Yes.
You're going to flee to survive. So you're not going to process emotions. You don't have that luxury. And with trauma memory, you have to begin to get in touch with the intense anxiety, the intense fear, the sadness, the loss, the depression. All of these things are underlying post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorder. I've treated patients that were severely sexually abused as children, young children, and they developed different personalities as a defense mechanism to process and keep that sexual abuse memories separate, so that otherwise it's too overwhelming for a child to be sexually abused, and it's life threatening. And to get them to feel safe enough and aware enough, and this is a lifelong process, I will say.
Sure.
Yeah, to begin to recognize those different personalities and begin to put the pieces of the puzzle together with their sexual history and their trauma, and it, even though it's processing such horrible anxiety and loss and fear and profound depression and feelings of unworthiness and hopelessness and helplessness, that you have to process all that and digest it and get in touch with it, which is horrible. But the beauty of it is that if you can do that, and many people can do that, and I help many people do that, that then they can transcend that trauma, and they can expand their life. They can be more expansive and proactive in their life. So it's very common for people like you, for people like me that have been in war zones, that have put ourselves on the front lines, that at minimum you're going to have post-traumatic stress disorder, not if not dissociative disorder, panic attacks, depression, anxiety. Yes.
You mentioned something that really touched with me, and it's so I mentioned I went to Michigan to work on my live in the woods, and actually I didn't go there to do that. It was kind of a byproduct of COVID. I didn't want to be in Las Vegas. I'd rather be in the woods of Michigan when all the crazy was going on. And one of the things I found, and I tell people, I go, I don't think anymore. I feel, right? And you mentioned going into your body. I am very big on my body sensations. And I know, it's kind of interesting. And it makes me excited when I talk to someone who mentions this and understands it, because so many people think it's this woo-woo thing. But my body, I feel sensations in my body all day long. And I equate it to, it's my subconscious that's monitoring the 24/7, trying to protect me, and that it can't communicate. So it can't communicate with speech. So it communicates through sensations by hitting alarm bells, or in my case now, before all I ever felt was bad sensations. A couple of years ago, that's all I felt, just terrible sensations. Now I feel good sensations, and it's kind of like, I have this beam, and I'll throw up ideas or thoughts or solutions to problems. And if it doesn't feel good, I'm like, oh, that's not the solution. And I go till I actually get this full glowing, wonderful sensation in my chest. I go, that's the answer, closer to where I need to be. Can you go into that for people?
Sure. No, I think it's such a beautiful example of your evolution and your processing your trauma, which it's so inspirational, because it's hard. It's very hard work, and it's getting in touch with horrible feelings of loss and tragedy and sorrow. So, yeah, I think what happens is that many of us are function outside of our bodies, especially in the Western world, where we have to do, where we have to race to work and home and obligations. And often we aren't even aware of what we're feeling. We're not in our body, we're outside of our body. It's sort of like we're a hamster on a treadmill, just racing, and we're shut down, we're dissociated. I believe that all of us, and I'm talking about healthy people now, have dissociated self states that we go into and out of throughout the day, that we're not even aware of, that it's a result of trauma, and it's very unconscious. So I do feel that you have to process feelings of loss. Look, being born is traumatic in life. All of us experience loss and tragedy and sickness and death and dying, and it's part of being alive. And I think you have to begin to process those things in order to begin to process the good things, and in order to begin to be in your body. Just like you said, if we don't process unconscious feelings of loss or pain or sorrow, what happens often is it goes into our body parts. So for instance, I'll give you an example. A patient of mine was so enraged at her mother, and it was during her wedding, where her mother wouldn't recognize her and kept on telling her she had to do all these things to be a good daughter, that my patient went to try to hit her mother in the face, and her arm went like she had paralysis of her hand. So like that's an instance of, she was so rageful and she didn't process it, and it went to a body part. And in that instance, maybe it was a good thing, although I would prefer my patient to be aware of her rage and be able to assert herself verbally and tell her mother, look, this is very painful for me. You're not recognizing me as always. This is my special day. I'm getting married. Please, could you just leave me alone and have some empathy for a moment? That's an example of it. And there are many examples of it with people believing they're paralyzed when it's an emotion that they put into their spine, for instance, and they really believe that they're paralyzed. I mean, that those are extreme instances of it, but it's very common, and I myself have done that, and similar to you, have been very much outside of my body, dissociated, and I really feel like being poisoned has put me more in my body, ironically, and that I can feel if I'm tired and I need to rest, which is a constant lesson for me. But that, if I have a pain or an ache, I process it. I don't tell myself, just suck it up. You're a big baby. Like, just get out the door and go run, which is what I always did. That I'm much more aware of what I'm feeling and thinking. I am more in my body, and I just think that is so important with evolving through feelings of loss and tragedy. Yeah, that and most of us do have these dissociated self states that, and I'm talking healthy people here, not like personality disorder or a fugue state where someone goes to a different town and forgets their past existence. I'm just talking people who are functional, who have different dissociated self states throughout the day and just aren't even aware of it. Yeah.
In your book, Desire for Destruction, you call for a holistic approach to combating terrorism. And I think we over-identify with terrorism sometimes because it went from this whole, more the international kind of terrorism to, kids yelling at each other in school in some way. But at the same time, there's an uptick in violence within society, within the world, everything that's going on, from suicide bombers to mass shooters, all of that. And you mentioned that, violence in our society is it's an indicator of how healthy our society is. So can you unpack that one, the holistic approach and what all that means?
Definitely. It's a great question, and it's all what my book is about. So because I felt marginalized growing up, I always identified with marginalized people. People are ostracized, bullied, shunned, mocked, ridiculed, and throughout my life, I've always stuck up for them and tried to show them that someone cared. So in my work with domestic mass shooters, what we found in our research, which actually we won an award for it, which I'm getting next year.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes, thank you. It was so much work. It was a labor of love, really. For like 5 years, I studied court records of these domestic mass shooters, and I spoke to forensic psychiatrists and psychologists who would evaluate them. And what we found was that often these children are marginalized, isolated, ostracized. They come from families that have frequent dislocations, so they're constantly moving and they can never really get roots or develop friendships. They often feel humiliated and shunned by society. And often they do get identified as being troubled. They're the school shooters that I studied often are expelled from school or identified by the school as having mental health issues. Either they're psychotic or depressed, and often they also are identified by law enforcement. Many of the adult mass shooters had criminal records and had mental health issues, and they're identified as troubled, but somehow tragically they fall through the cracks. They don't get the psychiatric care that they so desperately need. And this is what my book is about. Often it's mental health stigma, which is people are embarrassed to admit that either their child is psychotic or they're psychotic, that their child has homicidal suicidal ideation, or the perpetrator has homicidal suicidal ideation. Often they're delusional and they believe, for instance, the mass shooter in North Carolina felt that there was race wars going on, and he wanted to wake people up. He wanted to wake white people up that Black men were raping white women, and that there was a race war between Black and white people. He's the one that went into the Emmanuel Church in South Carolina and killed all those prominent Black people. I mean, it was a horrific crime, but he heard voices. He was psychotic. He had downward drift. He was ostracized, marginalized, couldn't hold a job. He didn't really have any friends or contact with his family, and didn't want mental health treatment. And also, I should say, they're often the smartest person in the room, as this person was. He had a high IQ, smarter often than doctors and judges and teachers and family members. And they feel if they're psychiatrically diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or depression, that their delusional message will not be heard, which it probably wouldn't be, and that it wouldn't come out. So they don't want psychiatric care often. So what we found in our study was that 87.5% of domestic mass shooters had undiagnosed, untreated psychiatric illness, and that often if they survived and were in prison, ironically, then they got the psychiatric care that they so desperately needed. And often were put on atypical antipsychotic long-acting antipsychotic medications, and within 10 days weren't hearing voices anymore, expressed profound regret for shooting their parents and schoolmates, often became model prisoners in the jail, got their GED, got their BA degree, became voracious readers of classical literature, were the electrician in the penal system, and taught yoga to their fellow prisoners, and had a spiritual practice where they actually prayed for the people that they killed because they needed to be on antipsychotic medication. And I often say this, which is, there is no difference in having schizophrenia or depression or bipolar disorder and having heart disease and needing a cardiac medication. There shouldn't be any shame with it. It's a biological disorder, and sometimes it's genetically inherited. And it's like having diabetes or heart disease or developing cancer. These are things that are medically, organically based and that need treatment. So I feel that very much so, the violence in our society is an indicator of how sick our society is, because what we do or don't do as an individual has ramifications. So if you see someone being bullied and shunned, do you reach out to that person? Do you just say hi? How are you? Do you look in their eyes and say something's not wrong? I want to talk to you. I want to buy you a cup of coffee. Or do we ignore those people? Are we so self-consumed with ourselves and our safety and so scared and frightened that we don't want to reach out to those type of people because they are often are scary people? Do we reach out to people who are suffering in wars and or just even our next door neighbor? There's a great TED Talk. It's Aaron Stark, and the name of the TED Talk is I Was Almost a School Shooter. And it's this lovely man, super bright, high IQ, typical to most of these domestic mass shooters, who grew up in a family that dislocated frequently. He was poor. He didn't have proper clothes or food growing up, and he was mocked and ridiculed because he was big person. And he was going to go into his high school, and get revenge which is a normal thing. The feeling of revenge is a normal thing. All of us experience it. We want revenge for what we feel is wrong. And he was going to go to school, become a school shooter. That he went to say goodbye to his next door neighbor. The next door neighbor simply said, "Something is not right here. You don't look right. I want to talk to you." Gave him some food. And just a simple act of kindness, one simple act of kindness, that's all that it took for him not to be a school shooter. And that's what my message is really in my book. And A lot of people told me not to go to Chechnya. A lot of my colleagues think I'm crazy to have gone down to 9/11. They never would have gone down to help. And I have no regrets I'm proud of what I did. I know I helped a lot of people at 9/11. It turned out to be other first responders and family members and construction workers, but I helped a lot of people down there, and I certainly helped a lot of people in Chechnya as well. And if I made the difference in one person's mind that someone cares enough to help them and is going to go to Chechnya and then bring them back to get medical care, and that they feel that they're supported and seen and not shunned. Chechnya was largely internationally shunned. It was globally ignored because Chechens are Muslim, and also the West was quick to get on board with Putin against the war against terrorism. And they ignored history. And then this is another example. They ignored what was going on in Chechnya, and then Putin did it again with no feelings, no regard, because he knew no one would care in Syria and Georgia. And then he did it in Ukraine. And I think partly because we identify more with Ukrainians because they're blonde-haired, blue-eyed, we seem to wake up and show outrage that this is a genocide, and then give support to the Ukrainians. But Putin has been doing this for decades, and that's another indicator, like how healthy or divisive our society is. And it's can we listen to each other if we have differing opinions? Can we be respectful and make space for other people, especially if they have differing opinions? This is an indicator really of how either divisive our world is or how well we're doing. And I feel like the gun violence is really an indicator, in particular of America, how divisive, divided we are, and how there's such this desperate need for us to come together. To me, it's showing human kindness to people that are invisible, that fall through the cracks. The Oxford High School shooter in Michigan is a great example of that, where his parents probably didn't receive love and were traumatized growing up themselves. And then they had a son, and they didn't know how to be actively engaged with him, to really take serious symptoms that he was telling them, apparently through news reports, that he heard voices, he had paranoid ideation at home, that people were out to get him, that he was suicidal. The school had called in the parents several times that he was suicidal, that they needed to get him psychiatric care, and they dismissed it, didn't take it serious. And then the day of the shooting, also then the father bought him a gun. And when he asked his parents for psychiatric help, they mocked him and told him to suck it up. And the day of the shooting, the school saw that he had drawn this picture of a gun and with blood. And he said, blood, blood everywhere. The thoughts won't stop. Please help me.
Yeah.
And I think the school in this instance did a really good job with him. Although I do think there needs to be more of an interdisciplinary approach between school, parents, law enforcement, and mental health workers, so something like this doesn't happen again, where a poor kid who's suffering with schizophrenia doesn't get diagnosed and treated. But they did call in the parents. The parents didn't bother to tell the school that they had bought him a gun. And then the school didn't bother to check his backpack to see that his gun was in his backpack. And the parents, I guess, didn't bother to notice that the gun was missing from their house. The parents refused to bring him for psychiatric care, so the school put him back into class. And he killed I think he killed four kids and wounded many. And if you listen to his videotape, he says the motivation for his killing other students was that he wanted to show them how alone and isolated they were. He wanted to kill the prettiest girl in the class because he wanted to teach her a lesson of how alone they are. And this is an awareness of a 15-year-old. Like, he doesn't have the skills or the awareness or the knowledge to know that, unfortunately, it was his child experience that actually he's not really isolated or alone, that there were people who cared, although he didn't have access to them. And it's just it's a preventable tragedy in my mind that this poor kid who was suffering it from schizophrenia, which is what it seems like, his parents wouldn't bring him to psychiatrist, probably because they were embarrassed or
Well, there's that
they were,
stigmatism that's out there, right? There's
yeah.
still a lot of people still have that stigmatism, and I think it's one of those things that drives me a little bit bonkers sometimes when I think about it. Here, we're a first world country, and we don't dedicate. Everybody has mental health, problems at some point, and when I talk to some people and they're like, oh, I'm struggling in their 40s or 50s, I'm like, it's interesting that what we call it a midlife crisis. I'm like, you've just dealt with a lot of stuff and your brain's kind of, it's maxed out. I find it interesting with speaking about the marginalized people in society and how this, there's a lot of this, predominates with them. And, there was the shooting this last weekend at the Super Bowl party. I don't know what it is, Super Bowl parade in St. Louis, I believe it was, or Kansas City, somewhere up there. And they, it's coming out now that what it sounds like to me was it was 3 people who were in gangs, and, gang members are marginalized. You actually, I know you speak about and refer, I think in your book, to Muhammad Atta, one of the ringleaders of 9/11. How he was going down this route, and that what led him. Can you go into Muhammad Atta? Because we tend to think of Muhammad Atta, I think, as this, here's this mastermind, which he was, and all that. But at the end of the day, he's just a guy who committed a bigger act or a more impactful act of violence based upon this lifetime of. And Muhammad Atta hits with me a little bit too, because when I was overseas, spending all the years, I was one of the key leaders at the Baghdad embassy for embassy security and stuff. Is we knew that the suicide bombers, a lot of times, sometimes it was, they would grab a person who and they held their family, or there was a reason, but a lot of the time, I'd say the majority of the time, they found these disaffected young men who didn't have anything going, promised them the 72 virgins and everybody will know your name, and let's pump you up, and here's a suicide belt, here's a suicide car, go drive it in and, go down that road.
Absolutely. And not just the 72 virgins, but often their families become very prominent. They're given a lot of money for the suicide terrorism, and their exalted status. Their family has an exalted status of both power and money in their communities. But no, I'd love to talk about Muhammad Atta, because he's a perfect example of what I talk about in terms of psychoanalytic and spiritual perspectives on terrorism. Because so mostly international terrorists, they're a little bit different than domestic mass shooters, in the sense that often they can be educated. As Muhammad Atta was, he was an engineer. He was super bright. He was very soft-spoken, and he came from a very wealthy family, a very prominent Egyptian family, and a very religious and strict Egyptian family, obviously Muslim. And when he became this terrorist, he had a spiritual practice, which is he wrote a diary on how he would purify his body, and how all the other people who flew planes into the buildings would purify their body every day, every morning, and how they felt that they were teaching Westerners who were sinners, because Westerners listen to music, they date, they have sex, they drink, they smoke. These are all mortal sins, according to Muhammad Atta and strict fundamentalists who practice the Muslim religion feel. So he very much felt remorse. So he went to college. I don't remember where he went to college. I think it was either in America or in Europe. I think it was in America, but basically in college, he wasn't that strident. He wasn't a fundamentalist, and he dated. I think he probably drank alcohol, and he felt this incredible humiliation and remorse for that. And also, I think was enraged for America with the wars that we waged in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, which was retaliatory and primitive in my mind.
Mhm.
But more importantly than that, he was ridiculed and debased by a really sadistic father. His father called him, and I forget the word in Islam, or in Egyptian, little bird. He was very effeminate looking. He had a very beautiful face. He had really beautiful eyelashes, long eyelashes. And the father also mocked him and emasculated him and called him a mama's boy. And I believe a lot of the motivation psychologically for his actions were that he wanted to prove his potency to his father. He wanted to prove how powerful he was. He wanted to prove how masculine he was, that he wasn't his mama's boy or a coward or a sissy, that he was this potent, fearless, fundamentalist fighter who flew a plane into the World Trade Center building, and that he felt that fire in particular was the most purifying means of all means to both purify him of his sins and Westerners of their sins. So it had this basis of the spiritual perversion of his believing that he would be purified, the Westerners who would be burned would be purified for their sins, and that he was going to prove to his father that he was this powerful warrior and he wasn't a mama's boy and a sissy. And it's very tragic. It's very tragic. He actually also wanted to go fight in the Chechen War on the sides of the Chechens. So he also was involved in all of that, and he became, very strictly religious, and then was involved in a lot of the training and wanted to go fight in the Chechen War. I don't think he did, but yeah, no, it's such a tragedy, and he's such a good example of what happens with international terrorists, because he was exploited, right? So he was depressed, most likely he was depressed. And then you have these people who are recruiters who are often sociopathic and narcissistic, and they know how to exploit people. And I do feel like he was used, he was exploited based on childhood feelings of impotency, and that, this was a spiritual, in my mind, a distorted spiritual way to purify him and Westerners of our sins.
Wow. Yeah. No, you can see that thread running through everything. We touched on empathy. We touched, grace, vulnerability, and all that before. What are your thoughts on empathy, grace, and vulnerability, and how we can use them to better our daily lives, to deal with stress and the world that we're in?
Yeah, I think that grace and grit and empathy is so key to living a life of joy and harmony. So for myself, in order to get myself better, one of the things I had to learn, and it's still a lesson, is that I meditate. And it's very hard for me to be still and in my body and deep breathe and meditate, but that it's so important. It's a way to really check in with your body and your thoughts and your feelings, like what is really going on, that we can get so distracted up in the course of the day with everything that's happening. But I just feel if we don't have empathy for each other, we're never gonna survive this, what we're facing. How do we more have empathy for what people are going through? Like in my book, I don't fault Muhammad Atta. I try to understand him.
Mm-hmm.
And there's if you want to listen and make the time to listen, there's always a reason for why someone has killed someone, raped someone, shot someone. it doesn't excuse the behavior, but there's always a reason behind it. And in my mind, you have to understand those things if you want to even begin to have a chance to change it.
Yeah. I think when it comes to empathy too, what I found is I really struggled for a long time with having empathy for myself. And it was it takes a while to get there, right? Like you just all of a sudden don't wake up one day and have empathy for the world. And especially people you fundamentally disagree with, to find out their why. Once I understand a person's why, where I go, you know what, it makes sense why they believe the way they do. I don't worry. I'm not trying to change them. It's like, okay, I understand you and I can feel you. But it really it opened the door to where, wow, I'm, understanding everybody else. And I'm like, okay, I understand why you're doing this. Maybe I need to practice that with myself. And that was, I think it's been a big part of my healing process.
I absolutely agree. I think I continued to learn how to have empathy for myself. I'm tough and hardest on myself. And it's, you really have to have empathy first for yourself, I think, to heal. And I think in our Western society, so many of us are taught, not to have any empathy for ourselves, not to be in our bodies, not to process our feelings, that if we're doing that, we're sissies or we're victims or we're self-involved. And actually, it's the opposite, that we need to have empathy first for ourselves, really to have empathy for anyone else. And I think it's instrumental to healing, is how can we love and have empathy for ourselves.
Yeah. You had mentioned too, earlier, and about being in touch with the universe and the spiritual. And I'm very, again, this goes, and a lot of people, unless they experienced it or they experience it, they don't, it seems ethereal. It seems, again, very woo. But I used to meditate, and then I stopped practicing it. And it was what I did to early on with my post-traumatic stress. I got into meditation. I was really good at it for a while. I stopped practicing it, and now it's very difficult. But what I found is going out and grounding in nature. Every morning I get up, first thing I do is walk out barefoot, and I stand outside barefoot, and I get in with nature as much as I can where I'm living. And I feel that energy more, and and that interconnectedness. I tell people, I'm like, we're all energy. I mean, our cells are held together by energy, and I still haven't read an explanation that satisfies. I don't know, maybe is it a conspiracy side of my brain? I don't know, where I'm like, how do our cells stay together? They're these little fragile things. When you flick your hand, they don't go flying off. Like they stay together by energy, right? And so trees, everything has energy, and I feel that interconnectedness there, and all that. And I found that also really helps too, to go out and touch on that.
Absolutely. For me, nature in particular is and has been so healing. So I will run on this beautiful trail in Nyack that to me is so healing. And if I'm struggling with what to say with the patient, or an insight, or a word that I'm trying to find in my writing when I wrote my book, or with my writing now, it always comes to me when I'm in nature, without fail, that it's this running meditation, and that somehow nature and trees and dirt and the beauty of nature is so healing. I had this encounter with a wild gray whale, and it's in my book, which which was so healing. And it was kind of marked from 2005 to 2012, when I had an encounter with this whale. It marked the culmination of all of my spiritual knowledge and work, but it just solidified it. And this whale's eye. So basically, I was paddleboard surfing for the first time in Laguna Beach, California.
Uh-huh.
And I had taken a lesson with this nature photographer who had a camera. And the ocean was like a glass. There was hardly a ripple, much less a wave. And I took really quickly to the paddleboard. We went really far out. And when we were coming back, this magnificent pregnant gray whale that was migrating down to Baja, California to deliver her baby, came up to me 15 feet, spy hopped me, which is when a whale vertically comes up out of the water. 2/3 of her body came up out of the water, and I literally had eye contact with her from when she came up out of the water all the way up, towering above me. And her left eye just held and contained me like no other. She taught me in an instant how to listen, feel, and think in a new way. She provided this inner corrective emotional experience for me. I really believe that I had beckoned her and she had beckoned me. My instructor said how lucky I was that that never happens, that it's really rare that wild gray whales will come up and spy hop someone. And I knew it had nothing to do with luck, that we had beckoned each other and that she was my mystical mother and I had lived past lifetimes with her. I know it sounds really far-fetched. My family roll their eyes, but she was my mystical mother and she loved me and recognized me. She told me, I don't need to keep myself small. When you're big, you don't have to play it. You are it. You know, gray whales don't have teeth like orcas. They have balines, which is like fingernail consistency. And that here was this nurturing, womb-like fatty presence who she rocked my world. Like she changed my world. It literally lasted seconds. She came up again 30 feet to me and spy hopped me again. And my instructor was about 50 feet to the side of us. And he missed on his camera her spy hopping me. He got on the camera her footprint in the water. And I believe because she didn't want it to be photographed. It was just the most magnificent moment. I mean, this whale's eyes was the most wise, intelligent being I've ever been around. And it was unbelievable. I think it was the most beautiful moment of my life. And actually, I went down to Baja, California to try to look for her. There's these adventures down there where many gray whales will come up to you. I kissed like 8 gray whales. And I was looking, I call her Molly, and I didn't find her, but often I will soothe myself and I will meditate just visualizing the incredible beauty and wisdom of her eyes with her left eye. And it was just so reaffirming on so many levels. I was born legally blind in my right eye, so I primarily use unifocal vision to see, and most people see bifocally, but whales use unifocal vision because their eyes are on either side of their skull. Mm-hmm. And I felt like she was saying to me, you know, I felt defective about that growing up, that I was legally blind in one eye. And I think my mother in particular felt that way, that I was defective in some way, or that she was ashamed of me, or that she felt ashamed herself. And I felt like it was this reaffirming, loving message that it's perfectly normal to have unifocal vision, that, you know, she just had this ability to come up to me and not startle me. They also talk about the 10-foot barrier, where if you're within 10 feet of a whale, it's too overwhelming. And I wasn't overwhelmed at all. I was like gobsmacked when she came up to me, and I simply froze. And it was just an amazing experience. And just thinking about her eye when I'm anxious or I'm struggling, it really does quiet me down quite a bit.
That's amazing. That's a great story. You know, it's, I think everybody can admit that the universe, the world, whatever we want to label it, works in mysterious ways. I believe that, you know, that's a saying that's out there, right? That's what people say. And I think that people need to be in tune for the unique experiences that impact their lives and make their lives better. And, you know, I think that's a great story and a great place to wrap this up. So I really appreciate it. And before we get out of here, go ahead and, if you would, let people know where they can find you, your book, and everything else that you have.
Yeah, it was great being with you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Brian. So You can find me on my website, which is www.ninacerfoliomd.com. This will be posted there as well as on social media. And you can buy my book, which is a mouthful, and I did try to change the name. Actually, if you just remember Desire for Destruction and Nina Cerfolio, you can buy it on Amazon. But the entire title is Psychoanalytic and Spiritual Perspectives on Terrorism, Desire for Destruction. And I hope it just makes a difference in one person's life. It was a labor of love. I had to learn how to write and use a computer. So it was a long journey for me, but it was a loving one. And I feel like my book is my baby, and I'm really proud of it. And I hope that if it helps one person, it's worth all the work.
That's amazing. I love your message. I love your history, your background, and everything that you have going, and the help that you're bringing to the world. I think we need a lot more of that today. So I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Brian. Keep up the great work.